There are places in the deep woods where the silence feels heavy, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Most people pass through these stretches of wilderness without ever noticing the subtle shift in the atmosphere, but some discoveries are not meant to be forgotten. This is an account of a boundary that was never supposed to be crossed, found in a place that no longer exists on any official map. The trek began in the high Uintas, a stretch of rugged peaks and dense lodgepole pines where the cell signal drops to nothing long before you reach the trailhead. I had been walking for 3 days, following a decommissioned logging road that felt more like a dry creek bed than a path. The sun was a pale, filtered disk behind a veil of thin clouds, casting no shadows against the gray-green carpet of the forest floor. Everything about the morning felt typical for a solo excursion into the backcountry, from the rhythmic crunch of my boots to the weight of the pack against my shoulders. I stopped by a small unnamed stream to filter water, watching the clear liquid swirl over smooth quartzite stones. The world was loud with the sound of rushing water and the occasional chatter of a squirrel in the branches above. It was roughly an hour after leaving the stream that I saw the first flash of color against the monotonous brown of the timber. A strip of bright orange plastic was tied neatly around the trunk of a dead aspen, its edges crisp and clean, as if it had been placed there only minutes prior. There was no writing on the ribbon, no surveyor's code or trail number, just a vivid artificial scream against the natural landscape. I paused to check my topographic map, tracing my finger slowly along the contour lines that showed I was deep within a protected wilderness zone. No logging, no road construction, and certainly no new trailheads were permitted in this sector of the national forest. The ribbon looked too new to be a remnant of an old study, the plastic still supple and smelling faintly of a sharp industrial chemical. 50 yards further up the slope, I found the second marker, and then a third, forming a perfectly straight line that cut directly across the natural flow of the terrain. They were spaced with mathematical precision, each knot tied with the same obsessive tension. I felt a slight prickle of unease, the kind that comes when you realize you are not as alone in the woods as you previously believed. The trail I was following began to taper off, reclaimed by encroaching ferns and fallen logs, yet the orange ribbons continued with unwavering confidence. They led me away from the high ridges and down into a narrow limestone-walled canyon that seemed to swallow the midday light. The air here was cooler, damp with the scent of ancient stone and rotting vegetation, but the ribbons remained bright and defiant. As I descended, I noticed that the forest was growing strangely quiet, the transition so gradual that I hadn't realized when the birds had stopped singing. The wind, which had been a constant companion on the ridges above, died down to a complete and hollow standstill. I stopped walking to listen, but all I could hear was the thick, muffled thrum of my own pulse in my ears. I reached a small clearing where the canyon floor leveled out, and it was here that the pattern of the ribbons changed. Instead of a straight line, the orange markers began to curve, leaping from tree to tree in a wide, sweeping arc. They seemed to be cordoning off a specific patch of old-growth timber, a perimeter established with an invisible but urgent purpose. I stepped over a fallen trunk to get a better look at the center of the marked area, and the silence became absolute. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but a physical weight that seemed to press against my eardrums, deadening the noise of my own movements. Even the dry twigs beneath my boots didn't snap. They simply gave way with a soft, muted thud, as if the ground were made of wool. In the very center of this silent circle, the trees looked different, gnarled and stunted, their bark scorched a deep charcoal black, despite no signs of a recent forest fire. The ground was unnaturally level, cleared of the usual mountain debris, and covered in a fine gray silt that looked like wood ash. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn back, yet my feet kept moving toward a small glint of metal embedded in the earth. I knelt down, brushing away the gray dust, to reveal a heavy bronze disc, bolted to a concrete pylon that had been swallowed by the forest floor. The metal was cool to the touch, and though the edges were pitted with age, the inscription was still perfectly legible in the dim light. It bore the seal of a federal agency that hadn't existed since the early 20th century, accompanied by a single, cryptic string of coordinates. At the bottom of the plate, the date, 1924, was stamped into the bronze, the numbers deep and sharp, and it felt impossible that something so old could be the focal point of markers that looked as though they had come off a hardware store shelf this morning. I looked back at the orange ribbons, their neon glow appearing almost radioactive against the blackened trees and the gray, silent soil. I pulled my journal from my pack to sketch the markings on the plaque, my hands shaking slightly in the unnatural cold of the canyon floor. And every few seconds I found myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced that the silence was about to be broken by a voice or a footstep. But there was nothing, only the orange ribbons, flickering like small plastic flames in the shadows of the gorge. As I worked, I realized that the chemical smell was getting stronger, a pungent odor of ozone and processed polymer that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It draped over the clearing like a heavy shroud, making my head swim and my vision blur at the edges. I stood up slowly, then quickly tucked my notebook away and decided that I had seen enough of the surveyor's strange work. Before leaving, I reached out to touch one of the ribbons, curious if I could find any manufacturer's mark or identifying print on the plastic. The material felt strangely warm, vibrating with a micro tremor that traveled up my arm and settled in the base of my skull. I pulled my hand back instinctively, a cold shiver racing down my spine as the ribbon continued to flutter, even though there wasn't a breath of wind in the canyon. The vibration in the ribbon didn't cease when I let go. Instead, it seemed to bleed into the surrounding air, a low-frequency hum that I felt in my teeth. I stepped back slowly, my boots crunching on the gray silt, which now felt as fine and dry as bone meal underfoot. The orange of the plastic was so vibrant, it felt like a hallucination against the dead, monochromatic colors of the inner circle. I began to retrace my steps, moving slowly, eager to climb back out of the canyon and return to the familiar chaotic noise of the living forest. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I found that the path I had taken down was no longer clear. The undergrowth seemed to have shifted, the ferns leaning at odd angles, obscuring the narrow gap between the limestone walls. I looked for the ribbon I had just touched, the one that had marked my entry into the silent zone, but it wasn't where I remembered. It was tied to a different tree now, 10 feet further to the left. It's not identical, but its position impossible. I stood frozen, my compass needle spinning in a slow, lazy circle, as if the magnetic north had simply dissolved. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, despite the chilling temperature of the canyon floor. I told myself it was the lack of light, the way the limestone walls played tricks with perspective and depth. I moved toward the relocated ribbon, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps that sounded like tearing paper in the absolute silence. When I reached the marker, I noticed a second ribbon tied just 6 inches below the first one, brand new and glowing with that same artificial intensity. This one wasn't a simple strip. It had been twisted into a complex geometric shape that resembled a mathematical sigil. I reached out a trembling hand, but stopped before making contact, remembering the strange warmth from before. I turned my head, scanning the perimeter of the clearing, and saw that every single tree was now adorned with multiple orange streamers. They were appearing in the periphery of my vision, silent and sudden, like bright wounds opening up in the bark of the blackened pines. The circle was tightening, the gap between the markers shrinking, until they formed a continuous neon fence. I began to climb the steep eastern slope of the canyon, speaking softly, slowly, letting the silence settle between each thought, ignoring the lack of a trail and clawing at the loose rock and soil. My fingernails snagged on roots that felt like cold iron, and the smell of ozone grew so thick it tasted like copper on my tongue. Every time I looked up to gauge my progress, a new ribbon was waiting for me on the next branch. "Stop here!" I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a damp rock face, and pulled my radio from the side pocket of my pack. I keyed the mic, the familiar click of the transmission the only comfort in the suffocating quiet of the gorge. "Is anyone on this frequency? I'm in the North Canyon. I need a position check," I whispered, my voice sounding distant and thin. The radio hissed with a burst of static that shaped itself into a rhythmic, pulsing tone, mirroring the vibration I had felt in the plastic. There was no human voice, only the sound of something vast and mechanical turning over deep beneath the earth. I turned the volume down, but the sound continued to leak from the speaker, even after I switched the power off. I looked down at my hands and realized they were covered in the fine gray silt from the clearing, and where the dust touched my skin, it left faint, glowing outlines. It was as if I were being marked, a physical signature of the zone, beginning to take hold of my own body. I wiped my hands frantically on my trousers, but the glow remained, stubborn and ghostly. The sun must have been setting, though no golden hour reached the bottom of this deep, limestone-carved scar in the earth. The sky above the canyon rim turned a bruised, electric purple, casting long and jagged shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. I felt the weight of the silence shifting, moving from a passive absence of sound to an active, predatory pressure. I found a small ledge halfway up the canyon wall and decided to hunker down, hoping that daylight would restore the logic of the trail. I pulled out my emergency blanket, the crinkle of the silver foil sounding like a landslide in the stillness of the mountain. I wrapped it tightly around me, watching the orange ribbons below begin to luminesce in the gathering dark. From my vantage point, the symmetry of the markers became even more apparent, forming a perfect glowing hexag around the central pylon. The lines were so straight they looked like laser beams, cut through the mist that was beginning to boil up from the canyon floor. It was a grid, a calculated map of a space that defied the natural laws of the wilderness. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of a soft, rhythmic snapping, like the sound of a flag fluttering in a high wind. But there was still no breeze, and the air remained as stagnant and heavy as water at the bottom of a well. I looked down and saw the ribbons dancing, their plastic bodies twisting and coiling around the trunks like orange snakes. I realized then that the ribbons weren't just marking the perimeter. They were measuring it, adjusting the boundaries of the silent zone in real time. The circle was smaller than it had been at sunset, the glowing orange lines now inching their way up the slope toward my ledge. I scrambled further up the rock, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I climbed, I looked back at the 1924 pylon, which was now bathed in a pale, flickering light emanating from the silt itself. The bronze disc seemed to be vibrating, the coordinates etched into its surface glowing with a dull internal heat. I realized the survey hadn't ended a century ago. It was still in progress, and I had wandered into the middle of the workspace. The light from the pylon began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic cadence that matched the static I had heard on the dead radio. It cast long, distorted shadows of the gnarled trees against the limestone walls, making the canyon floor look like a shifting, liquid map. I reached the top of the ridge, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but when I looked out across the plateau, the forest had changed. The familiar silhouette of the distant peaks was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable gray mist, a mist that swallowed the starlight and the horizon. Below me, The orange ribbons had reached the base of my ridge, forming a tight, glowing cord that hummed with a physical, bone-deep intensity. And I realized, with a sudden, hollow dread, that the ribbons weren't just following the trees anymore. They were suspended in midair. I moved along the rim, desperate to find a break in the perimeter, but the neon line was continuous and unwavering in its geometry. Every few yards, a new surveyor's plaque sat embedded in the rock, each one dated 1924, and each one cold to the touch. The chemical smell of the plastic was now so overwhelming that it felt like a physical weight in my lungs, bitter and synthetic. I stopped near an old lightning-struck cedar, and for a brief second, the mist parted to reveal a glimpse of the world beyond the boundary. I saw a valley that looked like my own, but the trees were moving in a wind I couldn't feel, and the sky was a deep, natural blue. It was only a few hundred yards away, yet it felt as distant as a memory from a previous life. I stepped toward the gap, but the orange ribbons lashed out with a sharp, snapping sound, weaving themselves into a dense lattice across the opening. The vibration intensified, a high-pitched whine that made my vision fracture, and my balance falter on the uneven stone. I fell to my knees, the gray silt on my hands glowing brighter as it pulsed in sync with the markers. When I looked down at the ground between my boots, I saw a fresh survey ribbon tied around a small, jagged stone, a stone that hadn't been there a moment ago. I looked back toward the canyon, and the entire landscape seemed to be folding in on itself, the distances between the trees shrinking. The silent zone was no longer a place in the forest. It was becoming the only place that existed. I pulled my journal out one last time, my fingers numb and clumsy as I tried to record the coordinates from the nearest bronze plaque. But the ink on the page wouldn't stay still, the letters drifting, reforming into symbols I didn't recognize. The paper itself felt like the orange plastic, warm, vibrating with that same unnatural, mechanical heartbeat. The mist began to pour over the ridge, like a slow-motion waterfall, erasing the trees, the rocks, and the very ground beneath my feet. I stood up, wrapped in the silver emergency blanket, and watched as the orange ribbons finally met behind me, completing the fence. I was no longer an observer of the survey. I had become a permanent feature of the map they were drawing. The silence returned, more absolute than before, pressing into my mind, until I could no longer remember the sound of the wind or the birds. I turned around to look for the way I had come, but there were only the glowing lines, stretching out into the gray nothingness. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint, metallic click of a surveyor's chain being dragged across stone. I sat down on the gray silt and waited, watching the orange glow of the perimeter as it slowly dimmed into a soft, steady pulse. The world beyond the ribbons was gone, replaced by the mathematical certainty of the grid and the cold weight of the bronze. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since entering the canyon, I felt perfectly, terrifyingly still. The markers remain long after the surveyors have moved on, defining a space that the rest of the world has agreed to forget. Some trails are not meant to be hiked, and some boundaries are not meant to be tested, lest you find yourself on the wrong side of the line. If you see a flash of orange in the deep woods where no road should be, do not follow the trail. The map is already finished. This record was recovered from an abandoned backpack found near a canyon rim that does not appear on any survey since 1924. No footprints were found leading away from the site.